So in the spirit of Chanukah, assimilation, and political topics of sensitivity, it's always important, and we always warmly embrace the opportunity to discuss topics that are somewhat conflicted or held to be complicated or divisive. These are opportunities to, first of all, deepen your knowledge in these various areas of Halakhah, and they are also opportunities to at least analyze both sides, regardless of where you end up. If you give both sides a fair fighting chance, you will have learned more about the topic in general, hopefully will enable you to make more informed decisions and more informed halachic and philosophical calculations, which is really the goal. It's not my job to tell people what to do. It's my job to teach them the sources, the mekorot, and to discuss, the halachic and philosophical implications and ramifications of our choices, and then hopefully people make decisions for themselves. It's about as much as you can hope to do as a rabbi or as a parent. So this topic is an especially close one to my heart, because it's one of these beautiful intersections of Halakhah and Hashkafa. You'll find a lot of people shouting very loud on both sides about what it is that they feel and believe, which is typical of people who shout very loud. It doesn't necessarily mean that whoever shouts the loudest wins or is right, but it's an indicator that the temperature rises in the room when this topic comes up. And if it's so important and so divisive, usually it's because the halachic arguments aren't perfectly clear. If it was a black and white issue, it would be black and white. So we don't eat pork. You don't find people getting very upset when you sit in a room, even of people who aren't observant, even in a room with people who aren't even Jewish. No one gets really upset when you say, we as Jews, we don't eat pork. It's not contentious, it's not conflict-ridden, it's a pretty fair and honest and objective statement. Jews keep Shabbat. Well, not too many people claim that they can smoke a cigarette and with a straight face tell you that they keep Shabbat, or maybe they do in their own special Kabbalistic way, but it's not the way normal, rational human beings think or respond to the topic of Shabbat observance. In fact, most people who don't keep Shabbat, they have even minimal understanding of what Shabbat is and the Halakhot as to how it's observed, will tell you, no, I don't keep Shabbat. If I were to keep Shabbat, here's what I would do, but I'm not there just yet, or it's of no interest to me. But they're not claiming that Jews, or those who claim to adhere to the Torah and the Mitzvot, keep Shabbat. So what of Beit HaMikdash, or Mekom HaMikdash now, the place of what used to be Beit HaMikdash, much to our chagrin and embarrassment, it's still in a state of ruin. We're going to have to look at, and again, to do this topic justice, it would take more than a week, but since Hanukkah is ultimately a celebration of the rededication of what already was erected, what already was constructed, it's very interesting to consider what's the status of this if this is where these miracles happened, if this is what we were celebrating. In fact, Beit HaMikdash was there but contaminated. That's what we meant to discuss in the first half of the shiur, but this is the halachic facet, the halachic aspect of Chanukah. They had a Beit HaMikdash, it was contaminated, they did purify, rededicate, and we read on the 8 days of Chanukah, in fact, the korbanot that were brought by the Nesi'im, by the chiefs of these 12 tribes, on days 1 through 12 of the dedication of the original Mishkan Mizbeach combination. What later becomes Beit HaMikdash, it's portable in the span of time between our leaving Egypt and our coming to Israel. In fact, we had the Mishkan up for already a few hundred years before we built the first Beit HaMikdash, the entire period of Yehoshua and the Shoftim, through Shmuel until not David, but Shlomo HaMelech. This is the very beginning of Sefer Melachim Bet. So the second book of Kings is where Beit HaMikdash gets built. You're going through easily maybe 300, maybe 400 years before it actually happens. Now, we know that where Beit HaMikdash was, there was a different status for different areas, and this the Gemara learns from the Mahane itself. A little bit technical, but we're told in the very beginning of Chumash B'Midbar, that's the fourth of the 5 Chumashim, Hashem speaks to Moshe and he commands him, you command the rest of the nation, وَشَلَحُوا مِنَ مَحَنَةٍ كُلَّ tzarua v'chol zav v'chol tamei lanafesh. Moshe is told at this point, now that the Mishkan has been erected and everything's been properly set up, the camp itself has a status of kedusha to it, has a status of holiness to it, and it's divided in three ways. There's what we would refer to as Mahane Shekhinah. There's the camp or the encampment that contained the Mishkan. So you have the Kohanim and Leviim living right around it. Where the camp of the Leviim begins, so Moshe is living really a little bit outside, but Olam Moed is right behind the Mishkan. Where the rest of the Leviim are living, it's already like this second concentric circle, if you will, the second level out. Referred to as Machane Leviyah, because the Leviim are living around the Mishkan. Beyond the Leviim, you have Machane Israel. This is already where the rest of the Israelites are living. Inside Machane Israel, they were commanded to reject or to eject from the camp people who had higher forms of impurity, so tzara'at, zav or zava, and tu'at met. There are some finer details to this, where they're allowed to be and where they're not. The Shekhinah has it with us the way it was during the time of the Mishkan. For the purpose of our discussion, we relate to Har HaBayit itself as Machane Leviyah. It's not Machane Shekhinah necessarily. We relate to it as this is a place where one needs to be. It's possible to be potentially tamemet. You can have this contamination, this impurity of having been in the same edifice, the same structure as a deceased human being, deceased Jew, a little bit more particularly, cemetery. We're all born in hospitals. I mean, it is what it is. We all have the status today of tamemet. No one contradicts this. No one challenges this. We don't have the red heifer, the parah aduma. Therefore, we're not.
To have the parah aduma, we would need the Beit HaMikdash.
Well, right, a little bit more involved. We would have first. We would have to have a parah aduma. Second of all, it would have to be prepared. And it's fine that there's no one who's tahor right now to do it, but it would have to be slaughtered, burned to ashes in its entirety, sprinkled in water. You can dilute it indefinitely. Really, all you would need is one jar. It's quite possible, incidentally, it seems this way from the Mishnah, that there is water from the parah aduma under Har HaBayit today. That's another topic for a whole other discussion, by the way. What's going on Har HaBayit or what's under it. I have a fascinating video to show you at some point, not now. Rav Yehuda Meir Getz, the former chief rabbi of the old city, he was from Tunis. And Rav Getz describes in very vivid details, he says, as a matter of fact, he's being interviewed, not a few years before he passed away, and this interviewer asks him something about the Aron, the famous lost ark of Indiana Jones. So there are these theories that it was taken to Africa, to Ethiopia, it was taken to the Vatican.
The Vatican, I always heard.
Okay, so he told her he knows exactly where it is. If it were Shayach, he would bring it up now. And he said that the only thing that they're going to do with it is put it in some kind of museum where all sorts of half-naked people are going to walk past it, take pictures, and say and do nonsensical things. He said it's better. Chazal had good judgment, and they hid it for a reason. But he held very, very firmly that it never moved from where it was buried on Har HaBayit. The Mishnah described it as buried on Har HaBayit. And you could pretty much, you could pinpoint the location if you wanted to.
From the Mishnah?
From the Mishnah.
So anyone who has someone with a strong understanding of the Mishnah, maybe a few additional texts would be able to find out?
I would agree with you, were it not for the crux of the Machlokhet about Har HaBayit, which is as follows. Just about everyone agrees, and it's a very difficult point to counter. Just about everyone agrees that there are portions of Har HaBayit you're allowed to walk on. Okay? Up until now, we're pretty much friends. The question is only, how do we delineate and define these places? In other words, very bizarrely and very ironically, it's almost HaKadosh Baruch Hu's sense of humor, that it comes down to how much do you trust the Arabs? Okay, because Jamaat al-Aqsa and the main mosque, the golden domed, there's two mosques on Har HaBayit, but the golden domed one, the one that's much more irritating to us because it's sitting, according to Arab legend anyway, it's sitting right over Ibn Shatiyah. And Ibn Shatiyah, the Gemara says, this is the stone on which Yitzchak Avinu's Aqidah took place, and probably buried under a few layers of sediment. But if we believe that Ibn Shatiyah, which was under Kodesh HaKodashim in Beit HaMikdash, is where the Arabs tell you it is, in other words, that they built their mosque over what used to be Kodesh HaKodashim, then it becomes relatively easy for us to to map out where your average, ordinary, impure Jew, i.e., you and I and the rest of us, can walk on Har HaBayit and where you can't. Okay? A couple of very important points to it. We're not halfway done with the halachic discussion. We'll get to the hashkafic one in a minute. Assuming you can rely on the Muslim tradition of where Even HaShetiyah is, okay? There probably never was a time when the land of Israel was empty completely of Jews. There probably were times where there were no Jews living in Yerushalayim. You have Jewish communities. I met myself. I saw with my own two eyes a Jewish woman whose family was from Tzfat that had never left, not since the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash anyway. She doesn't know if her family was in Bavel 2,000 years ago. She knows that since then, the family never left. The family, Faraj, is the family's last name.
And they can track the genealogy tree? Or
as far back as they have ketubot in the family, they're all located in Eretz Yisrael. Family never left, never went anywhere. Their customs are not Syrian, they're not Lebanese, they're not Egyptian, they're not Moroccan, they're not Yemenite. They've been in Eretz Yisrael ever since the destruction. There are a few families like this. So they were never the majority, at least not since the destruction of Beit HaMikdash, but there were always Jews there. The problem is that we don't have a Jewish, an unbroken chain of Jewish testimony as to where Har HaBayit, which, ironic as it sounds, you would think it's the holiest, most important place on the planet. Nonetheless, we were banished from the holiest and most important place on the planet, and it's going to come down to this. If you make your calculations correctly, and already we have to use the word if, you're starting from where the Arabs believe Even HaShetiyah and Kodesh HaKodashim was, and they'll tell you this, incidentally, if you ever took the underground tour of Har HaBayit, which is a source of great pain and disgrace to the Arabs, because they have no choice but to admit that the Jews were there before them and occupied the land, and in fact you find those little bits and pieces of pottery. They have coins that have Hebrew script on it. It's very annoying to them.
So
they built those tunnels. They didn't ask for the permission, but they built those tunnels in order to prove this point. And you come out in the middle of the Arab quarter, which is also irritating to them. So if you go under Har HaBayit, they will tell you at a particular point, this is the point that, they've triangulated it, and this is the point that, from a GPS perspective, corresponds to exactly where Even HaShetiyah used to be. And the Mishnah will tell you in Masechet Brachot that if you are praying, like Amidah, regular everyday Amidah, imagine this is Halakhah Ma'aseh, you should be facing Eretz Yisrael, because, okay, we don't have GPS, at least not in our minds. It's very difficult to face the right direction. Or the Halakhot, if you should face the right direction, or meaning regardless of the topography of the world, or do you go the way we fly, which is we always try to fly further north than we need to because the earth is shorter that way. It's like a squashed circle, and going around the long way is going to take you a lot longer than going the short way. So if you've ever been on a plane, you did notice, and not by accident, that when you fly from here to Israel, you almost go up to Greenland. And the reason is because it saves you a lot of flight time and a lot of gas. So the Gemara says, if you're outside of Eretz Yisrael, you should face Eretz Yisrael. Inside Eretz Yisrael, you should face Yerushalayim. Right? So when I was in Yericho, for example, we prayed west. I don't know how many thousands of years it's been since my family was praying east. I mean, between Morocco, which is almost exactly west of Eretz Yisrael, Maghreb, they call it in Arabic. It's the west, the country of the west. Morocco, you face east. Maybe in Russia and elsewhere, you were facing south. Moscow is almost directly north of Yerushalayim. Here we're praying west. It's a very interesting distinction. When you're inside Yerushalayim, says the Gemara, you pray towards Har HaBayit. So inside Yerushalayim, you're going to pray north, south, east, or west, whichever corresponds to the general direction of Har HaBayit. When you're near Har HaBayit, says the Mishnah, you pray towards Kodesh HaKodashim. Not just towards Har HaBayit, not just towards Beit HaMikdash, specifically you direct your tefillah exactly to the place the Kohen Gadol would go only twice a year in Yom Kippur. Wants to go in, put the Ketoret, wants to take it out, that's it. That's it. So you would direct your tefillah as accurately as possible if you're within, let's say, at least eye shot, when you can at least see Har HaBayit from wherever it is that you are, close enough that you can actually direct your tefillah to Kodesh HaKodashim. So there are people who take this underground tour, and they'll tell you, if you want to read Tehillim, as close as you'll ever come to, you've done it, yeah?
Yeah.
As close as you can possibly come to Even HaShetiyah, it's probably right here. Here's the trick. Rabbi Yitzchak Goren, who is a Rav Rashi in Eretz Israel, a very fascinating man. I'll tell you one funny story about him to give you an impression of who he was. He was, ferociously Zionist, right? Which is almost a dirty word in the Rabbanut, but yeah, he was very pro-Israel. So Rabbanut has become very progressively black with time, and I don't mean ethnically. So Rav Goren was the chief Ashkenazi rabbi when Rabbi Shalom Msas came from Morocco to Israel. The older Rabbanim in Yerushalayim, and even those that were somewhat involved in the Rabbanut, wanted the Rav Msas to be tested before they were going to give him a position on a Beit Din of the Rabbanut. Chief Rabbi of Morocco and the Ashkenazim wanted to give him a test before he was going to be given any position of halachic prominence in Israel. Rav Goren heard this and almost blew up the building. He said, "Are you serious? Like, do you realize the insult, the chilul Hashem he would cause by even implying that because the man comes from Morocco, he's not as learned or erudite? He had written Teshuvot and seen all the Ashkenazi books. I mean, it was just crazy, but this is how people thought. He was actually a very strong advocate of integrating the Sephardim to the Rabbanut and giving them the respect and the honor that their Chachamim deserved. But he met with resistance in the process. But this is Rav Goren. He was the rabbi during the second half of the 60s. He was also famous for a particular Psak Halakhah that really they tortured him over this until he passed away. It turns out he was right. When the Dakar, the Israeli submarine, disappeared in the 6-day war, they released an emergency buoy, which is supposed to help you locate. I mean, it's a little bit primitive for a submarine. That's pretty high tech, but when a submarine is in distress, it releases a buoy that's supposed to go straight up, and at least it releases radio signals. It emits radio signals that are supposed to help you find the buoy, and then you assume that the wreckage is within a certain area. That airplane that they never found, the Malaysian Air, whatever. So they don't do this anymore. They actually rely on a battery-powered radio transmitter inside the plane. And as primitive as it sounds, a buoy like this, especially if it's on a tether or some kind of a cord, would at least give you an idea of where the thing went. They never found it, and they may never find it. So the Dakar had released its emergency buoy, and it was never located. They found it, I think, in the late 1990s, if I'm not mistaken. And which is interesting because the Mediterranean Sea is not as huge. It's not the Pacific Ocean. I mean, it's not that gigantic. They couldn't find it. They had gone back and forth, hundreds of times. They just couldn't find it.
But they found the buoy.
The buoy they found, the SOS buoy. Yeah. By the way, SOS, save our souls. I don't know if you ever knew that.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, in Morse code. That's dot 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 dash dot dot dot. That's like whatever people know. Morse code is usually this. Like SOS means literally save our souls. Like we're in distress. Even enemy ships would sometimes expect someone to save them, take us prisoners, but get us off the ship. So, based on the Mishnayot in the second to last chapter of Masechet Yevamot, where you heard an echo, someone shouted, and you couldn't even find him. My name is Yitzchak ben Avraham, and I've just been bitten by a snake, or stung by a scorpion, or I just fell off a cliff. And you're basically telling someone that you're dying, with one witness who didn't even see you, but heard you give a sign of distress. We permit your wife to remarry. As long as it's likely, it's probable that someone in your situation wouldn't survive.
So it's very likely, but it's not 100%.
Correct. But Chazal were lenient, right?
So what if we find out that the guy is alive?
Mishum iguna aqilu rabbanan. Because of the situation of the aguna, what's the classical aguna? Not a woman whose husband's a jerk. The world's full of them. A woman who cannot find her husband. She doesn't know where he is. She doesn't know if he's living or dead. So she's aguna. She's anchored to this reality. She's chained. I don't know if my husband is alive or dead. If he's alive and I marry somebody else, I'm a zona, my kids are mamzeri. If he's dead, I'm an almana, I can marry a kohen. So because she can't resolve the situation, it's a safek, but it's a safek of 10 Commandments kind of gravity, and will tend to stricture. We'll have to assume that her husband is still alive. We don't know. So the slightest indication, even if it's only one witness, even if the only witness that we have is a woman or a child or even a non-Jew, says the Mishnah, and we let her remarry. We're very lenient when it comes to igun.
Except mother-in-law and all those things.
Except for the 5 women that are never trusted no matter what, and the mother-in-law is number 1, that's correct. Because we suspect she hates her for no good reason, which is generally the case. And that hasn't changed for 2,200 years. Take the Mishnah as your classic proof. Yeah, the technology has changed, the people in the nefesh have not. So Rav Goren permitted the agunot of the sailors on the Dakar. Incidentally, I have an uncle through marriage whose brother died on the Dakar. My aunt Hana lives in, used to live in Rishon LeZion, she moved, I forget where, Ness Tzion I think. But her husband, Shimon Casarola is his name. They changed the name, but that was his name back then. His brother was on the Dakar and he disappeared. Rav Goren said they released the emergency buoy. If Chazal were alive today, they would have accepted this as an echo or as a sound or a sign of distress. If you knew for a fact that somebody was in a burning building and never saw him come out, the Gemara says, we assumed we talked about this, we didn't talk about this, we should talk about this, but 9/11. You know someone was in the building collapsed, never found the body. So the Beit Din of America set up a protocol through which you can permit these women to remarry. And there's at least one woman that we know. A few actually, but one that we know better than the rest. So it's a situation that it's unlikely anybody would have survived. A shipwreck is the same thing. If I was on a ship that wrecked at sea, and I survived, and I know there was another guy there, but no one saw a sign of him, and I'm the only one that I know survived, I can say it was a shipwreck in the middle of the sea. I was lucky, I found a vest or a piece of wood. Everybody else we have to assume died, and on my testimony they would let all these women remarry. So Rav Goren let these women remarry. He was vindicated 30 years later. 30 years later, and posthumously, he'd already passed away. But they found the submarine. Every sailor that was on the submarine was accounted for, and they all died probably within not even a few minutes of the distress signal, and those wives married halachically permissibly. So Rav Goren, just to give you an idea, he was a real, you would say in a positive sense, a real jusqu'au boutiste when it comes to Halakhah. If this is Halakhah, there are new applications for it, we're going to go all the way. We're going to go all the way. He was very bothered by this question on Har HaBayit. Okay? To the Haredi community, Rav Goren is persona non grata because he was Zionist and because he was lenient in this Dakar submarine situation. Who cares that he was right? It doesn't matter. He was more flexible than Halakhah was generally flexed at this time. He went ahead and he said, look, we have a couple of historical precedents. Number one, the Radbaz. Well, really, before him, the Rambam. The Rambam writes about himself that he went to Eretz Yisrael and he prayed in Habayit HaGadol v'HaKadosh. He prayed Habayit HaGadol v'HaKadosh. This is relatively easy Hebrew.
The beautiful and
the great
and holy
house. The great and holy house of his mother-in-law, the great and holy house of his cousin, of his friend. I mean, how many great and holy houses are there in Israel? No, don't put it past people to say that might not have been Beit HaMikdash. That's how the Rambam wrote. It is typically rabbinically poetic language, and everyone assumes that he's referring to, if not Beit HaMikdash, maybe the mosque that's on it. Incidentally, the Rambam ruled that it's mutar to pray in a mosque, not to pray to Allah through the Quranic recommendations of tefillah. But he holds halakha that if you hear an Arab reciting bracha, that you answer Amen, because we believe in the same God and he's praying to the same God. And by the same token, it's permissible for a Jew to enter a mosque, probably much more ideal to go to a Bet Knesset, right? Don't get me wrong. But that it's permissible for a Jew to go into a mosque and to pray Amidah. Even Amidah, even the holiest of our prayers.
While they're praying, or it has to be when they're not praying, or it doesn't matter?
Not entirely clear that he makes a distinction between the two. In other words, they wouldn't be counted for a minyan, but as far as the place having, we wouldn't hold from, let's say, necessarily Kedusha in the sense of Bet Knesset being like a Mikdash Ma'at, like a miniature Bet HaMikdash, or a semblance, a vestige of what used to be Bet HaMikdash, but you're permitted to pray there, which seems to imply there's no isur in being there while they're praying, and for that matter, were it not maybe for things like Marita Ayn, if you don't want people to think that you're a Muslim, so you pray there and we might assume that you've converted, and maybe you eat camels and shellfish that they permit and we don't, so you don't want to give people the impression that you've converted to Islam. But as a locale for tefillah, you certainly can't do this in a church. No one alive will recommend that you say even a bracha or anything similar in or near a church.
I have an example.
Huh?
I have examples, but
of someone who permitted?
there is a whole Bet Knesset here in
Oh, that's not a real community. I don't even know if they count as reform. Whatever. It's a discussion. That's crazy.
Yeah, well, it's another
It's
story.
very crazy. The whole discussion of how you hold by Avodah Zarah, but that's just ignorance. That's not halakha. People who hold this way because they're politically correct are not.
So,
we know that political correctness is a
we-
form of mental disability.
So, following that stock, if you want to butter the Arabs, can't we just all dress with ShaBa? And I look at like an Arab already, and I can go and pray my Amidah there.
Have you ever gone through an airport with a beard like this? So it's very interesting what you're saying. I mean, look, just to pick up where we left off, Rav Goren was very adamant about a few things. Number one, he held, first of all, the Rambam holds it's mutar. And again, don't forget, this wasn't Halakhah Ma'aseh on a very, let's say, large scale. How many people had actually considered going up to you couldn't if you wanted to? In fact, during the Ottoman Empire, and bear in what's the Ottoman Empire? Maybe 500, maybe 600 years. I mean, it was a really long time. The Turks are in control of Eretz Israel. Jews aren't allowed even to the steps leading towards Har HaBayit. And for religious reasons. They were considered dhimmi, they were considered these like second-class monotheists, but whatever. And so they have their own Halakhot. the Kohanim are the Arabs, and the Jews are considered like Gerim or Mamzerim. You can stand outside, you can't even get on the steps towards Har HaBayit. You could barely make it to the Kotel. And incidentally, the Rabbanim who did, the Chidah Kadosh, for example, dressed like Arabs when they went. So your idea is not so. Yeah, this is what you had to do. You would dress like a Muslim, and hopefully you're familiar with a few Muslim prayers, and you would pretend to be an Arab, and you would go pray on, if not on Har HaBayit, at least to the Kotel. Rav Goren has an idea, and he says, look, we know the Rambam went to pray there. We know that that mosque has been there for a number of generations. It probably precedes the Ottoman Empire. And if that's the case, chances are the Rambam was talking about the same mosque in the same place, or at least that he was talking about Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount itself, where the Bayit HaGadol v'HaKadosh, this great and holy house, used to stand. Where exactly the Rambam went, we don't know. And that's one of the counter-arguments of the Haredi community. Wait a second. That he said he went there. First of all, who's to say it's Beit HaMikdash? Maybe he had lots of big and holy houses. Who knows? Second of all, even if he went there, how do you know where in Har HaBayit he went? And how does that correspond, if you claim to know, to what we have today by way of Har HaBayit? So Rav Goren said, look, no reason to suspect. The Rambam permits it. The Radbaz permits it also. Rabbi David ben Zibra, very famous posek from Morocco, very frequently quoted in the Beit Yosef. And the Rambam was born in Spain, but spent much of his life in Morocco also. So Rav Goren assumes the Rambam is talking about the mosque. He assumes the reference is to the Arab, let's say, geography of the Temple Mount of Har HaBayit. And he therefore says, I'm going to take, just like in their Mishnayot, Masechet Midot talk about this explicitly, very clearly. How many amot? Was it the Kodesh HaKodashim? Was it the Kodesh? So you have the Holy of Holies, the sanctuary, the Heichal, I guess would be what you would call a sanctuary. The Azara is more like a courtyard. Azarat HaNashim, you have the women's courtyard. And it's all very, very meticulously laid out by the Mishnah. Rav Goren didn't stop here. He said, hang on, I'm going to take from Ibn Shetiyah. I know east, south, north, and west. And I'm going to measure, not in my amot, not cubits from my elbow to the end of my middle finger. I'm going to measure according to the Chazon Ish. In other words, he's taking what's called a Humrah. His Humrah is, I'm going to assume Beit HaMikdash was as big as it could possibly be. If you have disputes as to what's the size of the Amah, so if the Amah is short, you're lenient because you permit more of Har HaBayit for people to walk on. If the Amah is long, you're excluding, because you're starting from the Kodesh and working out, outwards, you're excluding from use or from visitation a larger portion of Beit HaMikdash. So he takes the Amot of the Chazon Ish and he maps it out. And he comes to a few conclusions. Number one is that there's definitely plenty of space on Har HaBayit for us to enter, and they have plenty of maps available. There are a lot of organizations that push for this, they advocate for it very actively. Number two, most of the space from Jamaat al-Aqsa and south on Har HaBayit, when we go to the Kotel HaMa'arabi, you're going to the western wall. So the western wall, right, it's on the west side of Har HaBayit. It was a retaining wall that was built in order so Shlomo HaMelech could straighten out. Har HaBayit was round at the top, like most mountains and hills are. So he flattened it, and he built a wall around it to hold the extra dirt the extra dirt and gravel that they had flattened, in order to make a bigger and more rectangular surface on which he could build the Beit HaMikdash. The retaining wall and the land to the south of this mosque, according to Rav Goren's calculations, it works out perfectly. This is extra land that was added by Hordos, one of the Jewish kings. In other words, if you're standing, so here, just to make the geography make sense, let's say this cell phone, the Holy of Holies, the smartphone today, if I'm standing at the Kotel over here, and this is the western end of Har HaBayit, right? We call it the western wall, the Kotel HaMa'aravi. This western wall is not far from the southern wall, okay? Most of the space that you have to walk on Har HaBayit, is actually from the Dome of the Rock, as they refer to it, and south. And most of this space didn't even have the status of the original Har HaBayit, if you will, because it was added later. So this is not.
It was added while the Beit HaMikdash was still standing there?
It actually seems like Hordos even he broadened the area of Beit HaMikdash. So there was the first retaining wall built by Shlomo HaMelech. Either it was moved or expanded, or another one was put in its stead. I don't know that we have all the details explicitly. We know for a fact that Hordos made it bigger. And we know that he expanded it towards the south. So from the Kotel, and you've been to the Kotel? The most open space, I don't even answer I hope this is a rhetorical question. Most of the open space on Har HaBayit, in fact, they usually don't even let you that far into it, even if you want to go, is actually from this second edition by Hordos, which never even had the status of the Kedusha of the original Har HaBayit. Shlomo Melech added a little bit. Probably what he added was sanctified at the time and had the same status as the official Har HaBayit, even though technically some angles of it weren't necessarily as flat or as useful as they were before he flattened it. The long story short is that there's no doubt that there is plenty of space there that couldn't have been Beit HaMikdash even if you wanted it to be. And if you don't trust where the Arabs have pegged Ibn Ashatiyah and where they built their mosque, then you should probably not go anywhere in the area, for fear of stepping over what might have been Kodesh HaKodashim. In other words, it's not just a Humrah, you're actually so mahmir that you would have to take a whole bunch of things into account. So you assume that they're generally right when they identify this as Har HaBayit, and yet you question where they put Ibn Ashatiyah if they even know where it is. Rav Goren says, no, we have no reason to believe it moved. In fact, if they had it properly identified, it's probably because from the time the Jews were expelled and the Arabs took over, they had this place labeled. And so, ironically, irony of all ironies, that we have to identify Kodesh HaKodashim by the Arabs themselves, and where they claim to have a tradition, Ibn Ashatiyah is located. But it seems to work out with the architecture and the archaeology of Har HaBayit. And this brings us to the glorious hashkafic discussion. Just to be clear, so that we know what's at stake, the trespassing of Har HaBayit, at least the Kodesh HaKodashim, potentially even the Azara, of someone who has the status of Tmemet, who's contaminated by a dead human being, the status of these of walking over these spaces, it's an interdiction of karet. Someone who comes to Beit HaMikdash, or at least far enough into it, with a status of Tum'ah, is punishable by karet. Excision from the tree of life, the destruction of the nefesh. In other words, it seems like, according to the Arizal, that the nefesh, not necessarily the neshama, but the nefesh loses its eligibility for resurrection. That's not an especially pleasant thing for Jews who spend our whole lives hoping, anticipating the Techiyat HaMetim, the resurrection of the dead. So it's a very big deal. It's a very big deal, and therefore we take certain precautions. The opponents of the movement to encourage Jews to actually step on Har HaBayit, to visit Har HaBayit, and to make it known that there's a reason we're going, will tell you, because it has the potential for Nisur Karet, it's something we shouldn't even tinker with. Why play with fire? Why take the chance? What's the perceived gain? What's the potential loss? Do your cost-benefit analysis, and you'll come to the conclusion we don't take chances with Karet. Incidentally, this is also, I have no choice but to underscore one of these typically Ashkenazi Sephardi halachic attitude debates, where the Sephardim will say, okay, so it's potentially asur b'karet, do your homework, What's mutar is mutar, what's asur is asur, and we'll make our best efforts to keep things the way they traditionally have been. I pointed this out to you when it comes to nikur. The Ashkenazim are so concerned for the chelev, for the forbidden fats, and it's isur karet, it's a big deal. So their Halakhot and the different practices and customs ultimately led to the abandonment of the back half of the cow. They'll just sell it, or any animal for that matter, they'll sell it to the goyim at a break-even price and maybe a very marginal profit, and not even deal with it. The Sephardim would say, okay, so what's chelev is karet, it's asur, we get rid of it. We even take out things we don't have to. And we know this. We do take a bit of a precaution, in fact, quite a few. We're not going to throw the whole thing out. The same you'll find in the Ashkenazi attitude towards matzah. We spoke about this maybe this past year by Pesach. Difference between Ashkenazi and Sephardi matzah, where we said clearly the Mishnah, the Gemara, and the Shulchan Aruch give you a tefach. You have 3 to 4 inches that you can bake something that thick, dense, but that thick. It's considered matzah. Matzah is considered bread. Bread, the bracha is hamotzi, and birkat hamazon. Doing tilat yadayim before, etc. So no one bakes matzah this thick, even though we know me'ikar hadin, there's no problem with it.
How would you eat that?
My suspicion is very fresh and very hot.
Probably.
I think the colder and drier it gets, the more difficult it will be to eat. But the reality is, you could also shred it and still make hamotzi on it. So it doesn't necessarily. Or wet. You can make. It would be a matzah ball. You just cut round dumplings out of it and just fry it or put it in soup. Perfectly permissible. That's a whole other discussion, by the way. Eating wet matzah, the Sephardim were never concerned with this. So the Sephardim, we bake bread. It's a little bit thinner than the normal bread. It's a lot more dense, admitted, but it's flexible. It's flexible. The Ashkenazi concern for what could potentially be chametz, and therefore, what's the interdiction? The level, the severity of the interdiction of eating chametz on Pesach is what? Karet. The Ashkenazi response is what? Extreme. Because we're concerned with baking something that could look like, or potentially become, or might even be too close for comfort, to a chametz, which is an isur karet, we bake matzot that are so thin that they're crackers, and therefore they're mezonot, and shouldn't be hamotzi. It's a long discussion why that isn't generally the practice. It certainly seems logical that it would be. And so you end up, ironically, cutting off your nose to spite your face. Like, we're so afraid of baking what could be chametz that we don't even bake matzah that's called a bread. We bake matzah that's kosher for Passover, but it's in the category of crackers. It would be mezonot and ala mechia. Except that on Pesach, Moshe Feinstein's long explanation of why the definition of bread changes for 8 days, but then 2 minutes after Pesach is over, you're going to make mezonot to respect this custom of crackers. Okay, that's how everybody holds by crackers. So you have a lot of examples of this, and in Chot Nida you have a lot of this too. Ashkenazim would just as soon be strict, even where it's not even called for or necessary or halakhically justifiable in pure halakhic terms. But they'll explain to you, no, our justification is to distance ourselves from even the potential for isur karet, because where you find karet, we take extra precautions.
I can give you a lot of examples where this kind of mentality of being too careful has proven to scare a lot of people out. Especially when Jews came from North Africa to France, for example. A lot of them were like, we never did those kind of chumot in Morocco, and they left it all together. I'm not saying that they don't have a responsibility in it.
Correct.
They do.
It's a very common complaint. In fact, a lot of Sephardim were very disheartened when they came to Israel, France, America, for that matter, where a lot of them could identify much better what they didn't do in Chutz La'aretz and what they did. Okay, that's what the Ashkenazim do. This is not our practice, not our custom. A lot of people tell you, okay, so not everybody maybe covered their hair or wore a kippah. The women all covered their hair. Muslim country, that wasn't really an option. But men wearing a kippah inside, outside the house, okay, so maybe not everybody was super careful about it. Wearing tzitzit. Look in the Rishonim, the Rashba talks about it, it's a great idea, it's a wonderful thing, you want to wear tzitzit all day long. I can tell you for a fact that I learned about Rabbanim, more specifically Teimanim, who didn't wear tzitzit, rabbis, who don't wear tzitzit today. We're little, they tell us it's a chobah, it's an obligation, everybody should do it. That's it. The answer that I got when I asked, in Teiman, we didn't wear them. That's it. You can cry, you can kick, you can scream. It's a custom. We don't hold this way. So then the standards change, and then what happens if you don't wear tzitzit? You're considered like an outsider. Who takes you seriously? Who looks at you? It has implications and has ramifications.
And you hide them also.
Right. So not everybody sees them. Here the question is more complicated. It's not just, okay, you know what? You don't want to eat floppy matzot, you want to eat crackers. This I'll have to concede. You want to, you're more than welcome to. It's a personal, private issue. It concerns you, your digestive system, and maybe the people at your table. If you're concerned for eating chelev, you don't want to eat filet mignon, no problem. I'll sell as many of them as I can because I'm always back-ordered. I'm always understocked. That's fine. We'll enjoy it, and you'll eat whatever you'll eat. There are some really cute bits and pieces from the shoulder. I hope you enjoy them. When it comes to Har HaBayit, this is an issue of, literally, national concern. And so why would you be inclined to take the chance? In other words, to make the question a little bit more specific, why would Ashkenazi Zionist rabbis be departing from the Ashkenazi Haredi rabbis who are trying to discourage people from going anywhere near Har HaBayit? The answer is because there happens to be an issue of national importance. What's the issue of national importance? Well, the same issue that people would bring to your attention when it comes to places like Marat HaMachpelah, which is, if people don't go, the army closes it. And the Arabs believe it's theirs because no Jews come, and they go ahead and they publicize this, and they make the case in front of the UN and everyone who will listen, which is mostly France, Germany, Britain, and Italy.
We almost lost it.
Correct. Were it not for the fact that some very, very devoted, we'll call them settlers for all intents and purposes, because these people help us settle the land of Israel. That's a good thing. These people who refuse to comply with the government's recommendations. Were it not for these people fighting, and were it not for these people insisting that the army continue to protect us visiting our holy sites, because we're Jews and we have holy sites in Israel. There are many such holy places. We have tombs of tzaddikim and tzaddikot. We have former yeshivot. We have cemeteries. We have some very special and unique places in Israel that are part of our heritage. They're part of our identity. In fact, this is part of our claim to the land. Because the UN, and for that matter, the overwhelming majority of the Israeli government, would be very happy if the Jews would stop going to Har HaBayit, let the Arabs have it, and put an end, the way they see it, right, at least on Muslim terms, to the conflict. It creates conflict when we show the world this belongs to us. It creates a conflict when the world sees that we care, that we visit, that we have expectations, we have demands. And there is no reason whatsoever that our right and our claim to our own heritage, our own history, should be denied, or that the Muslim claim, which in this case happens to be mechila, but secondary and quite inferior, should be respected. The problem is that whoever kicks and screams the loudest gets heard. So we have to do some kicking and screaming. It's okay. You can be an Arab every so often. It doesn't hurt. We need to publicize to the entire world, to the entire planet for that matter, that this is part of our history, it's part of our tradition. In fact, our history in Israel predates that of the Arabs, especially most of the ones who live there now, because most of them came over from Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and Lebanon, Iran. It's important for us to stress and emphasize the fact. There happens to be a whole other discussion. This is another idea from the Rambam, by the way. We're told in Parashat Re'eh, we have an interesting mitzvah according to the Rambam, that there is a requirement. The Torah commands us, L'shichnu tidrushu uvat hashama. Hashem wants us to dedicate, right, to consecrate a place, a physical space. Didn't say Yerushalayim just yet in the Chumash. David HaMelech was the one who had this prophetic revelation. Hashem wanted us to find a place, to seek out a place, to proactively get up and seek out a place and say, you know what? We would like for this to be the house of God. As long as it was a place that Hashem approves of or chooses, that was prophetically determined. It's not for us to negotiate. According to the Rambam, we have an obligation to seek out a place to either, in the case of David HaMelech, to find a place on which we can build Beit HaMikdash. In our generation, to seek out the place of the Mikdash. And so the Rambam himself holds, it's just interesting that his name is so prevalent in this discussion, he himself holds, there's a mitzvah, even today, to go to Har HaBayit if possible, and if not, at least the Kotel HaMa'aravi, the Western Wall, during the Shalosh Regalim. That you fulfill the biblical obligation of pilgrimage, right? We call it Hajj, the Arabs call it Hajj. You fulfill the biblical obligation of going to the temple, or at least attempting to, trying to, going as far as you can, and showing that you want it, showing that you miss it, showing that you care, As if to say that once this, this becomes not just a gesture, but actually a national outcry, a national wish for a renewed Beit HaMikdash, it becomes possible again. And that the rebuilding of Beit HaMikdash depends on our desire to be there, to protest the destruction, if you will. Get up and protest. This is not the way the things are supposed to be, right? I protest the current pathetic state of affairs, and we demand that Beit HaMikdash be rebuilt. We want it, we're going to visit it, we're going to constantly make this voice heard and make our heritage public to ourselves and to everyone else. You can publicize the miracle to Jews or to non-Jews, but the idea is that we take this desire, we take this attraction public, and we make a very public claim on the space that ultimately is really not even so much ours as it is Hashem's. But that the impetus, the halachic responsibility is with us, is a point that the Rambam makes very clear when it comes to visiting, or at least showing a desire, an interest in the place of the Mikdash. So there are details to going to Har Bayit. We don't have the time to get into all of this now, but one who does want to go needs to be very careful to go to the mikveh, for example. Man or woman, you would be very careful about cleaning your fingernails, cutting them if they're long, not having any physical barriers to the water when you go. It's a serious concept. There are details as to where, even according to the opinions that we are permitted and even should make efforts to go to Har Bayit, still it's very worthwhile looking at these maps and realizing what you can and can't do there. You shouldn't go as a tourist. You have Halakhot like this. You should go in order to pray. Happens to be bitterly ironic that the modern state of Israel, after the 1967 conquest of, and I love that word, conquest, remember it and use it. The conquest, the Arabs attacked us and we conquered the land that Hashem wanted us to have. In fact, He gave it to us via Arab aggression. The conquest of Har Bayit and Judea and Samaria, after this period, it was a very poor decision made by very short-sighted Israeli politicians, but that pretty much sums up politicians from all over the world. They decided to cede control of Har HaBayit to not the Palestinians, but the Jordanians. It's actually members of the Jordanian police force that currently police the area. What are they policing? In order not to upset the Muslims, right? Because our job, our goal in life is not to upset Muslims. No matter where they are, they're very easily upset, very easily offended, and our job is to let them have whatever they want so that they don't get offended. And as such, the Jordanian police are in fact there, first of all, to maintain what they consider to be the sanctity of the place, i.e. no non-Muslims are allowed inside the mosques. Number two, they refuse to allow members of any other faith, even Jews, to pray there. So the Jordanian police are there in order to help make arrests. They'll give you over to the Israeli Border Patrol if you're caught praying on Har HaBayit, which ironically is really the only halachically permitting circumstance for you to actually go up there. So if you're a Swedish tourist coming to take pictures, Mechila, that's not what Har HaBayit is for. A Jew who wants to go up to Har HaBayit and recite Tehillim, this is actually how this entire concept is supposed to be carried through, conducted. And ironically, it's against Jordanian law. I care a lot about Jordanian law. I'm very sensitive to it, but with all due respect, a little bit more sensitive to Halakhah and to the importance of our publicizing our claim and our heritage, our right to Har HaBayit. There's no reason why, if we don't restrict Muslims from going pretty much to any site they want to, what Jews should be restricted from going to Har HaBayit. We had a beautiful opportunity to keep it under our sovereign control, and we squandered it as we did lots of other things.
So let's push it a bit very quickly because it's late already. So if we're not allowed to go for tourism, but we're not allowed to pray because we're going to get arrested, we have two options. Either we don't go, or we go and we get arrested. That's pretty much what it is.
The Jordanian police know that if a Jew who looks observant goes to Har HaBayit, they're just going to look at your lips. If they see your lips moving quietly, they're going to assume you're praying. They have to prove it though. So you can be reciting Tehillim very quietly, but they'll accompany you. They'll stand there and they'll watch you. Yeah.
Interesting. And is there a point of? Can we make a point of going there, even if we're not praying because we don't want to get arrested? It's not so convenient. And just going there to show that we're going there. At least we're doing the mitzvah of
l'shichronot tidorshu uvat hashama. You're looking for a place. You're actively looking for a place for the Shekhinah to rest. So your going is not as a tourist. You're going in order to protest, to demonstrate.
exactly.
Yeah. So
Did
this
you make a point for that?
this makes a lot more sense. Meaning, it's possible that even so, you're at least let's say you're fulfilling something by going. You're going there is much more meaningful than just going to take a picture and post it on Facebook. Location GPS.
Send a picture of my mom.
Temple Mount. Huh?
Send a picture of my mom like that.
No, it's okay. I mean, it's a beautiful. Again,
20 years ago, it's not a problem actually.
you're fulfilling the mitzvah of protest. You're going there and you're protesting. But this might be, if not a form of tefillah, I mean, a very important form of expression of Jewish identity and our desire to have unrestricted access to the place, which really we should. In fact, if it were under Israeli control, the Rabbanut probably would have no choice but to put up a fence around where even again, according to the Chazon Ish, with all the chumrot that you want, you can very clearly delineate the areas that Jews aren't supposed to be entering. Goyim probably shouldn't be going there to begin with. And then at least it would be much easier for us to make sure that everybody who goes put a mikveh right outside the thing, and everybody can go immerse. You can have somebody there helping, a little pamphlet explaining or a brochure explaining how to do the tevilah the way it's supposed to be done. And you've solved the problem. For the literally 2 minutes that we have left, there's the hashkafa that's in the hashkafa, if you will. The philosophy behind the philosophy of the situation is such that the question really boils down to whether or not it's good to give people who aren't perfect access to Kedusha. And you have a few areas of Halakhah that this is very hotly contested. Feel free to think for yourselves. You should come up with an example or two, because I have a bunch. Is Kedusha good or bad for people who aren't observant? Let's start there. The classic example, and the one that probably is the most hotly debated in the Rabbanut, assuming this is a non-issue because the Haredi rabbis don't want anything to do with Har Bayit. I mean, they do, but not that we should go and visit there, is do we force Chilonim to get married with a chuppah?
No.
Is it a service or disservice to the Chiloni population that the Israeli Rabbanut has exclusive control over who's considered married and who's considered not married according to Halakhah? And so if you'd like to get a civil marriage, the only place you can do it, or the closest place you can do it, is in Cyprus. That's a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it's good for the Cypriot economy because they're financially, fiscally incompetent, and they could use the tourist money. They don't deserve it, but they can use it. What's the halachic status of the secular couple that wants to get married? So you have the classic non-Haredi approach, let's call it the Zionist approach if you will, or the modern approach, which is, look, Kedusha can be helpful, it can be uplifting, if done properly, and if properly maintained, it might inspire these people to observe one or two mitzvot. They'll be procreating, which is a great thing. Nice, they should be married when they do it. They fulfill the obligation even if they're not. A little bit less ideally, but it works. What's the status of the Chiloni couple that gets married with a chuppah and then decide to engage in extracurricular activities? Well, if it weren't for the fact that they are married, they wouldn't be guilty of adultery. In other words, the married woman, the halachically married woman, is a Ten Commandment time bomb, because any man she has relations with aside from her husband is going to be a very big problem. This is how we create mamzerim, this is how we create niuf, how we create adultery. So, ironically, follow me here, ironically, the Haredi approach has been historically in this case, which is a little bit almost inconsistent, has been in this case to force the Chilim to get married. Why? Out of a somewhat far-flung suspicion, because it's a very minority position, that a couple that lives together as husband and wife and identifies themselves as such are considered halachically married too. We don't generally hold this way. We don't believe that a woman who's civilly married to a man and then has an affair with somebody else becomes a zona and her children become mamzerim. But Rav Henkin, who lived in Brooklyn, born in Europe, but he lived in Brooklyn, he held that we have a suspicion, and therefore any couple that's civilly married anywhere in the world, if he's Jewish and she's Jewish, and they have the civil legal entitlements of a Jewish, or the civil legal status of a married couple, like joint tax returns, for example, and for that matter, legal prosecution of abuse, of marriage, of fraudulent marriage, or fictitious marriage. So if we can file a joint tax return, but the IRS, or for that matter, immigration, what today they call DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, if they investigate my marriage and they find it to be fraudulent, then I have to pay fees and fines and penalties, and if I got a green card, I can have it revoked, etc. So Rav Henkin wanted to say that if you enter a civil marriage that has legal ramifications to it, then the couple might be considered married. What's the mechanism? The mechanism is the relations. They have relations. There's one of three possible ways you can marry a woman. That's bi'ah, shtar, and kesef. The first Mishnah Masechet Kiddushin. You can marry a woman by giving her an object of any monetary value. I mean, like more than a penny, and for the purpose of marriage. So today, customarily, we give a ring. You are hereby betrothed to me. I mean, literally engaged to me, or dedicated to me, with this ring, according to the laws of Moshe and Israel. And so I give her an object in front of witnesses, and I announce that I'm giving her the object for the sake of making her my wife and becoming her husband. And as such, the marriage is official. We can also, alternatively, write a contract that says, I'm hereby your husband, you are hereby my wife, signed by Shimon and Lewi, witnesses who are not brothers for this particular purpose, and you become married as well. It's possible to effectuate a marriage through a contract. Third possibility, no longer in general practice, is relations. If a man and a woman have relations for the sake of becoming husband and wife, this is one of the three possible ways of getting married. This is how it was done in the Tanakh. This is how, up until it became fashionable or more popular, to exchange items and not to seclude yourself in front of witnesses for the purpose of getting married. It's been supplanted by the more prevalent ring-giving ceremony. Do you need witnesses to this or not? So no one ever had witnesses inside the bedroom, but if you had witnesses outside, or if there was a marriage ceremony, and then the husband and wife went into what's called a cheder yichud, right? That's still done in most weddings. It was assumed that they were having relations, or that they could, but they were considered married for all intents and purposes, and those relations were going to be for the purpose of consummating the marriage. And that would be enough. Long story short, there may not be witnesses. The judge might have been a woman, or a non-Jew, or a non-Jewish woman, it doesn't matter. But she or he can pronounce the couple as man and wife, and they're civilly married, but if they have relations, they live together, and he, wants her as his wife and not as anybody else's, according to Rav Henkin, even though his grandson said he never meant to say this, didn't mean to create mamzerim by being so strict about any marriage is considered a halachic marriage. Nonetheless, it's a chumrah that the Charedim adopted, and they say, okay, therefore, the couple that is not halachically married but civilly married, we should recommend they should get a get if they separate. Whereas the more modern approach to this was, it's good for them to be married anyway. Maybe if they are living in total hefkerut, it's probably better they shouldn't be married. Opinions were a little bit varied on this. But the Haredi community, because they were machmirim anyway, that they wanted them to get a get, they say we may as well marry them and make things official anyhow. It's one example of a few others I'm not going to get into now, of whether or not Kedusha is actually good for people who don't necessarily know what to do with it. The Shemitah is another one. Do we actually want to buy Otzar Beit Din? In other words, do we want people to respect the Shemitah and buy products that were, buy B-U-Y, products that were produced under the Halakhot of the Shemitah and therefore have the Kedusha of the Shevi'it, or do we prefer to buy Yivul Nukhri? Because the typical Haredi response is we don't want Kedusha. We're not ready for it. And the more somehow between Zionist, modern Orthodox, I don't care what you want to call it, the non-Haredi approach to this has been, no, we actually want Kedusha. It means educating people and teaching them, but Kedusha is a good thing. We need more of it. So yes, we have the Shemitah. True, it should be observed. It's important. It's only midrabanan. It's actually much lighter now. Nonetheless, our approach is not let's run away from it. It's let's embrace it. We learn the Halakhot. We can hopefully spread more Torah, more wisdom, more truth, more spirituality. Same would go for Har HaBayit. The same would go for marriage, and where it's appropriate and applicable. Sure, encourage them to get married as long as they respect it. That's the goal. No one wants to marry chilulim that intend to engage in adultery. Well, it's very popular today. They write books about these things. But no one wants intentionally to create mamzerim or to create marital infidelity. In the event the couple is somewhat receptive to kedusha and intends to respect the holiness of the matrimony, of the institution of marriage, then yes, we encourage them to do it. But teach them. If you ever have a problem, Rav Moshe Feinstein changed his opinion on this, by the way. It's very telling. The beginning, we'll conclude with this. In the beginning, in the beginning of the Soviet Union, after the Bolshevik Revolution, you had a lot of observant Jews in Russia, Ukraine, Lithuania, and he was the probably the most prominent halachic authority in the area. They asked him when he was in his 30s at the time, what parents begged him to marry children that they knew were having relations anyway. So instead of going to yeshiva, they went to what they called the gymnasium, like the typical high school, and you'd have the Goldsteins and the Silversteins, and they would say, listen, our son and our daughter unfortunately were raised in a communist school. They've been going to communist school for a few years. They stopped keeping Shabbat, stopped putting on tefillin, no nida, no kashrut, nothing. Would you please do us a favor and marry them? To us it's a humiliation that our kids are not married and they're having relations. This used to be humiliating to people. It's been about 100 years, but it used to be humiliating to people. So Rav Moshe's response in the beginning was no. There's no reason for us to encourage people who are secular and living a debaucherous lifestyle to enter into the holy covenant of marriage, because it only creates problems if afterwards they're not going to get a get. She's going to cheat, live with somebody else. The communists didn't really care about any of this. Later on in his life, he was a little bit less adamant, but still pretty firm. Towards the end of his life, he said, I'm okay with marrying a couple that isn't perfectly observant, as long as they know enough to tell a rabbi if they're having problems and they want to officiate it, and they want him to officiate a get. It's not working out. We know that we're Jewishly married. We know that it has to be dissolved by a halachic mechanism that in fact dissolves the halachic religious marriage, that a civil divorce is not enough to make her permissible to another man, and then under those circumstances, or he said if they have a relationship with the rabbi, he was okay with it. But that's the point. If you care enough about Torah and Mitzvot to study the Halakhot of Harabait, go. People who don't care and do whatever they want probably shouldn't go. If you care enough about the holiness of marriage and matrimony to take it seriously, then please, by all means, here's the chuppah, here are the rules, here are the halachot. And if you don't care, you don't care. And if you don't plan to observe the Shavuot, then buy from the Goyim. You plan to observe it, Baruch Hashem. You win, both you learn and you absorb the Kedusha associated with the mitzvah itself. So, the discussion won't end tonight, but we'll have to pick it up. That's all next time.